It wasn't a warhead. It wasn't a cyber attack. It wasn't even a speech. It was a list. A quiet, calculated list issued from Beijing that slapped a 25% to 40% tariff on US-made vehicles, critical auto parts, and energy components. It took less than 48 hours to do what decades of lobbying, bailouts, and federal protectionism couldn't. It broke the back of America's auto giants. Ford froze production forecasts. GM slashed orders for critical components. Tesla watched its China strategy collapse overnight. And behind every shuttered factory gate and halted assembly line was a message. This is what happens when you push the world's factory too far. For years, Washington played tough, using tariffs, sanctions, and semiconductor bans. But while the US postured, China was calculating, watching, waiting. And then it struck. With one retaliatory move, China didn't just raise prices. It shattered the supply chains. It isolated the American auto industry from its most profitable growth market. And worse, it exposed just how unprepared the US really was. But how did that happen? In this video, let's break it down. When Beijing struck back, it didn't yell. It calculated. This wasn't some knee-jerk retaliation scribbled together by bureaucrats. It was a slow, deliberate, and razor-sharp maneuver aimed straight at the heart of America's pride, the auto industry. The newly imposed 25% to 40% tariffs weren't just a general swipe at US-made vehicles. They were the equivalent of a precision drone strike on the very arteries that keep Detroit breathing. Beijing didn't just slap tariffs on the cars themselves. It targeted the ecosystem that creates them. Aluminum from US mills. Semiconductors etched abroad but destined for American dashboards. Lithium batteries engineered with global supply routes, but assembled in US factories. Beijing mapped out the exact vulnerabilities in America's auto economy, and then pulled the lever on all of them. More than $20 billion in US automotive exports were hit overnight. But the real genius of the move was that China didn't just target finished products. It targeted processes. Disruption, not destruction, was the goal. The idea wasn't to obliterate American car companies. It was to make them bleed slowly, to introduce a level of logistical uncertainty so disruptive, so prolonged, that even the thought of expanding in China or relying on Chinese-linked supply chains became a boardroom liability. And Beijing didn't need to bluff, because China is the supply chain. The US auto sector once bragged about "Made in America," but today that label is often stitched together with imported thread. Engines rely on rare earth elements from Central Africa. EV batteries are powered by materials processed in China. Key components are designed in Germany, assembled in Mexico, and tested in Shenzhen. It's not made in America. It's assembled on borrowed time. So when China moved, it wasn't just punishing trade. It was exposing the fragility of an entire industrial model built on interdependence, and America's illusion of dominance began to unravel. The initial tremor hit Wall Street. In the 24 hours following the tariff announcement, General Motors stock fell by 9%, shaving billions off its market cap. Ford lost $4 billion in value almost immediately. Tesla, despite its global diversification, plunged by $12 billion amid fears that its gigafactories, sourcing contracts, and Chinese clientele were all suddenly at risk. But the real collapse wasn't digital. It was mechanical. Assembly lines across Michigan, Kentucky, and Indiana ground to a halt as procurement officers scrambled to revise orders. Production forecasts were slashed. Procurement executives rushed into damage control meetings. Automakers like Ford and Stellantis halted contracts with Tier 2 suppliers. The damage wasn't only at the top. It rippled all the way down. Interestingly, American carmakers rely on over 60% of key parts sourced from Asia. Everything from advanced driver assistance systems to wiring harnesses, steering sensors, and infotainment systems are either built or heavily dependent on Asian manufacturing bases, many of them operating directly within Chinese territory or connected to it. And the ripple wasn't just in parts, it was in time. Automakers were forced to delay launch schedules, including several EV rollouts that had been positioned as flagship projects for 2025. Supply chain disruption means software integration falls behind, certification lags, and dealerships sit idle, waiting for new stock. For some models, the delay could stretch to 9 months or more. Behind the delays are lives. Union workers furloughed, plant shifts canceled, raw material deliveries diverted. American families, many of whom rely on the auto sector for survival, were suddenly thrown into economic uncertainty, not because of internal mismanagement, but because Washington underestimated the scale of China's patience and precision. This wasn't just a trade dispute. It was a strategic decapitation, disrupting not just the goods but the gearboxes of an economy that built its identity on the assembly line. And with every shift missed, every shipment delayed, and every investor spooked, the reality became undeniable. The collapse didn't come from outside. It came from within. That's because now China is in the position to tolerate losing the American auto sector. Interestingly, it's the United States which cannot survive without the Chinese supply chain and Chinese market. However, once upon a time, China needed the American consumer like lungs need air. Today it breathes on its own. This is not 2005. The old global trade dynamic where China exported and the US consumed has been rewritten. In 2025, China is not just a factory. It is a competitor, a designer, a distributor, and more dangerously, a market maker. Automotive titans like BYD, NIO, and XPeng are no longer obsessed with cracking into the US market. They are dominating elsewhere. In Europe, BYD's electric buses are already standard public transport in major cities. In South America, XPeng's EVs are selling faster than Chevrolets. In Southeast Asia, Chinese vehicles are undercutting Japanese and Korean brands not just on price, but on battery range, infotainment systems, and smart mobility features. With state-sponsored financing, complete supply chain control from raw materials to final assembly, and a domestic population that is not only EV-hungry but nationalistically proud, Chinese automakers aren't looking westward. They are looking everywhere else and succeeding. And the numbers prove it. In Q1 2025, more than 62% of China's EV exports went to non-US markets. Even with tariffs, even with geopolitical tensions, China is winning on scale, speed, and strategy. Meanwhile, US car makers are staring at a dead end. Domestic sales are declining. Europe has its own brands. Latin America is turning eastward. And the one market that still had room for explosive growth, China, is now politically and economically closed off. You see, China didn't just slam the door shut. It walked out of the room and built another house. But the collapse of America's auto expansion in China is just the prelude. The real storm is broader, and it's gathering force. Shortly after the auto tariffs went live, Beijing escalated. It wasn't just about cars anymore. It was about empire-level leverage. China introduced new tariffs on petrochemicals, agricultural commodities, and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, each one a pillar of U.S. export strength. The timing was surgical. U.S. energy firms already grappling with price volatility were forced to reevaluate long-term LNG and oil export contracts. Agricultural exporters, especially soybean and corn farmers, felt the old scars reopen. Midwest agribusiness giants who had once survived Trump's first trade war found themselves once again caught between geopolitics and survival. But it didn't stop there. The semiconductor sector, the jewel of American technological dominance, is now at risk. New Chinese restrictions on rare earth minerals, which are critical for chip manufacturing, have already triggered emergency procurement measures among top U.S. firms. Foundries that rely on gallium and germanium are preparing for shipment delays, inflated prices, or outright shortages. And the software war is next. China's Ministry of Industry is reportedly preparing a ban on the U.S. origin software in government devices, an echo of earlier moves against Huawei and TikTok. This would not only cut off billions in licensing revenue for firms like Microsoft and Oracle, but it would also accelerate the rise of homegrown Chinese alternatives, locking American tech companies out of a market they helped build. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, and current affairs impacting your lives. The effect is systemic. What began as an automotive standoff has now morphed into a full-spectrum economic assault. It touches energy, food, technology, manufacturing, and finance. It exposes how deeply the U.S. economic engine relies on access to foreign markets, and how little insulation it has when those markets fight back. And yet, even as the economic fallout expands, Washington continues to posture. The press releases speak of strength and leverage, but behind closed doors, a different picture emerges. Corporate titans like Apple, Qualcomm, and Caterpillar are begging for exemptions. They are pressuring USTR officials, floating private offers through diplomatic back channels, and revising annual forecasts to prepare for a world where China is no longer a buyer, but a competitor and regulator. Because China isn't just retaliating anymore, it's retaliating with intent. It's not about balance, it's about rebuilding the rules. The trade war might have begun with confidence, but it is now ending with confession, and not the kind Washington wants to make out loud. Beneath the headlines and behind the patriotic slogans, the American economy is collapsing in slow motion. It's not a collapse in the traditional sense. It's more subtle, more systemic, and far more dangerous. Treasury yields are spiking again, not because of growth, but because of fear. Foreign governments, particularly China and Japan, are backing away from U.S. debt auctions, leaving the Federal Reserve to quietly absorb the slack. This isn't a vote of confidence, it's a warning shot. Inflation, meanwhile, refuses to retreat. Despite aggressive rate hikes, core price pressures remain. Energy is volatile. Food prices are sticky. Real wages, once the promised shield of the middle class, are losing ground. And as interest rates grind higher, the cost of servicing the $36 trillion national debt is becoming a fiscal time bomb. Every 1% increase adds over $346 billion to annual interest payments, more than the entire education budget. But what makes this moment uniquely perilous is how tariffs are acting as accelerants to a fire already burning. By raising the cost of inputs, everything from steel and semiconductors to electric motors and lithium, the administration has effectively taxed its own producers. As Chinese retaliation slashes export access, U.S. manufacturers are trapped in a no-win scenario. If they scale up production, their margins collapse under the weight of inflation and raw material costs. If they raise prices, already burdened consumers walk away. And if they cut costs, they lose ground to China's vertically integrated, state-supported competitors who don't have the same constraints. Every lever they pull leads to another failure. And yet, the only tool the White House seems to reach for is more tariffs, more restrictions, more bans. It's economic siege warfare, except this time, the U.S. is the one behind the barricades. But while Washington remains locked in its own echo chamber of defiance and denial, the world is moving on. Brazil is deepening trade ties with Beijing, signing multi-billion-dollar energy and agricultural contracts. South Africa and Nigeria are receiving Chinese-backed infrastructure deals with no IMF strings attached. Europe, once a stalwart of transatlantic unity, is increasingly drifting toward China, not ideologically, but industrially. With each new battery gigafactory, each EV investment, and each Belt and Road transport corridor, the gravitational pull of Beijing's trade orbit grows stronger. And America, it's playing defense, everywhere, economically, diplomatically, technologically. This isn't a strategy. This is a retreat in slow motion. Now Trump is surrendering and waving a white flag. For a man who once bragged that trade wars are good and easy to win, he now finds himself in a humiliating bind. After years of chest-thumping tariffs, factory shutdowns, collapsing exports, and retaliatory strikes that have decimated core American industries, especially autos, Trump is blinking, publicly, and desperately. In a stunning shift, the former president, now campaigning again for 2028 and seeking to revive the illusion of control, has announced that he is willing to lower tariffs on China. Not in triumph, not in strength, but in exchange for concessions. This isn't a strategy, it's a rescue attempt. Trump went further, telling reporters that he is already in talks with Beijing, suggesting back-channel negotiations are underway to normalize trade ties and find a path forward. But here's the problem. China isn't playing along. Within 24 hours, Chinese officials made it clear. No such talks are happening. There are no negotiations, no formal outreach, no intention to re-engage. The message from Beijing was crystal clear. The era of Washington dictating terms is over. That's not just a snub. It's a reversal of the global trade order. In the past, Beijing would scramble behind closed doors to restore favor with the US. Not anymore. Now it's Washington knocking, and China is not answering. Trump's sudden pivot wasn't inspired by goodwill. It was forced by economic reality. The US auto industry is bleeding, supply chains are shattered, and even agricultural states, once loyal Trump bastions, are seeing export markets dry up under China's retaliation. With inflation refusing to retreat and treasury markets teetering from foreign withdrawal, the old weapon of tariffs has now turned on its master. And make no mistake, Trump knows it. His offer to reduce tariffs in return for progress is not a deal. It's a plea, a white flag dressed up in campaign rhetoric. But Beijing isn't taking the bait, because it doesn't need to. Where once Trump spoke of America as the unbeatable economic powerhouse, today he speaks like a man looking for a way out. His policies didn't just backfire. They empowered the very rival he hoped to cripple. And now, that rival won't even take his call. What does it mean when the loudest man in the room goes silent? It means the game has changed, and Trump just lost the trade war he started. What began in 2018 as a tactical maneuver, Trump's opening tariffs on Chinese steel and solar panels, has now metastasized into a structural shift in global power. At first, the world assumed this was negotiation theater, that the US was leveraging tariffs as a tool to get better deals, that cooler heads would prevail, that China eventually would blink. But that story is now dead, because China didn't just respond. It evolved. It responded not with volume, but with precision. Not with slogans, but with supply chain sabotage. Not with panic, but with parallel institutions, from the Belt and Road Initiative to the digital yuan, from rare earth controls to a global EV empire. Beijing didn't want a tariff war. It wanted leverage, and it now has it. American companies are finally realizing that. CEOs are no longer asking how to win the trade war. They are asking how to survive it. Lobbyists are flooding Washington with back-channel requests for exemptions, concessions, and rollbacks. Tech giants, once silent, are now openly warning of lost revenue and supply chain paralysis. And automakers are looking for exit ramps from a road that no longer leads to profit. Meanwhile, China is offering something Washington can't: an alternative. It's telling the world, you don't need to trade in dollars. You don't need to obey U.S. sanctions. You don't need to fear American tariffs. There is another system, another pole of power, another way. That's not retaliation. That's a revolution. What do you think? Can the U.S. survive the tariff war it started by itself? Isn't it true that Trump's stance on tariffs was wrong, and he did not take into account how America would suffer? In the comment section below, share your thoughts on who you think will lose the trade war, the U.S. or China. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, changing world order, and current affairs. Things you need to stay informed. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.